Part 3, Section 10 of Swann's Way by Marcel Proust, translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief, 1889 to 1930. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 3, Swann in Love, Section 10. There was at this dinner, besides the usual party, a professor from the Sorbonne, one Brichot, who had met Monsieur and Madame Verdurin at a watering place somewhere, and if his duties at the university and his other works of scholarship had not left him with very little time to spare, would gladly have come to them more often. For he had that curiosity, that superstitious outlook on life, which, combined with a certain amount of skepticism with regard to the object of their studies, earn for men of intelligence, whatever their profession, for doctors who do not believe in medicine, for schoolmasters who do not believe in Latin exercises, the reputation of having broad, brilliant, and indeed superior minds. He affected, when at Madame Verdurin's, to choose his illustrations from among the most topical subjects of the day, when he spoke of philosophy or history, principally because he regarded those sciences as no more, really, than a preparation for life itself, and imagined that he was seeing put into practice by the little clan what hitherto he had known only from books, and also, perhaps, because having had drilled into him as a boy, and having unconsciously preserved a feeling of reverence for certain subjects, he thought that he was casting aside the scholar's gown when he ventured to treat those subjects with a conversational license, which seemed so to him only because the folds of the gown still clung. Early in the course of the dinner, when M. de Forceville, seated on the right of Madame Verdurin, who in the newcomer's honor had taken great pains with her toilette, observed to her, "Quite original, that white dress." The doctor, who had never taken his eyes off him, so curious was he to learn the nature and attributes of what he called a deux, and was on the lookout for an opportunity of attracting his attention, so as to come into closer contact with him, caught in its flight the adjective blanche, and, his eyes still glued to his plate, snapped out, "Blanche? Blanche of Castile?" Then, without moving his head, shot a furtive glance to right and left of him, doubtful, but happy on the whole. While Swann, by the painful and futile effort which he made to smile, testified that he thought the pun absurd, Forcheville had shown at once that he could appreciate its subtlety, and that he was a man of the world by keeping within its proper limits a mirth the spontaneity of which had charmed Madame Verdurin. "What are you to say of a scientist like that?" she asked Forcheville. "You can't talk seriously to him for 2 minutes on end. Is that the sort of thing you tell them at your hospital?" she went on, turning to the doctor. "They must have some pretty lively times there, if that's the case. I can see that I shall have to get taken in as a patient." "I think I heard the doctor speak of that wicked old humbug, Blanche of Castile, if I may so express myself. Am I not right, madame?" Brichot appealed to Madame Verdurin, who, swooning with merriment, her eyes tightly closed, had buried her face in her two hands, from between which, now and then, escaped a muffled scream. "Good gracious, madame, I would not dream of shocking the reverent-minded, if there are any such around this table, sub rosa. I recognize, moreover, that our ineffable and Athenian, oh, how infinitely Athenian, republic is capable of honoring in the person of that obscurantist old Chi Capet, the first of our chiefs of police. Yes, indeed, my dear host, yes, indeed," he repeated in his ringing voice, which sounded a separate note for each syllable, in reply to a protest by Monsieur Verdurin. The Chronicle of Saint Denis, in the authenticity of its information, is beyond question, leaves us no room for doubt on that point. No one could be more fitly chosen as patron by a secularizing proletariat than that mother of a saint, who let him see some pretty fishy saints besides, as Suger says, and that other great Saint Bernards of the sort, for with her it was a case of taking just what you pleased. "Who is that gentleman?" Forcheville asked Madame Verdurin. "He seems to speak with great authority." "What? Do you mean to say you don't know the famous Brichot? Why, he's celebrated all over Europe." "Oh, that's Brichot, is it?" exclaimed Forcheville, who had not quite caught the name. "You must tell me all about him," he went on, fastening a pair of goggle eyes on the celebrity. It's always interesting to meet well known people at dinner. But I say, you ask us to very select parties here. No dull evenings in this house, I'm sure." "Well, you know what it is really," said Madame Verdurin modestly. "They feel safe here. They can talk about whatever they like, and the conversation goes off like fireworks. Now Brichot this evening is nothing. I've seen him, don't you know, when he's been with me, simply dazzling, you'd want to go on your knees to him. Well, with any one else he's not the same man. He's not in the least witty. You have to drag the words out of him. He's even boring." "That's strange," remarked Faucheville, with fitting astonishment. A sort of wit like Brichot's would have been regarded as out and out stupidity by the people among whom Swann had spent his early life, for all that it is quite compatible with real intelligence. And the intelligence of the Professor's vigorous and well nourished brain might easily have been envied by many of the people in society who seemed witty enough to Swann. But these last had so thoroughly inculcated into him their likes and dislikes, at least in everything that pertained to their ordinary social existence, including that annex to social existence which belongs, strictly speaking, to the domain of intelligence, namely conversation, that Swann could not see anything in Brichot's pleasantries. To him they were merely pedantic, vulgar, and disgustingly coarse. He was shocked, too, being accustomed to good manners, by the rude, almost barrack room tone which the student in arms adopted, no matter to whom he was speaking. Finally, perhaps, he had lost all patience that evening as he watched Madame Verdurin welcoming with such unnecessary warmth this Forcheville fellow, whom it had been Odette's unaccountable idea to bring to the house. Feeling a little awkward, with Swann there also, she had asked him on her arrival, "What do you think of my guest?" And he, suddenly realizing for the first time that Forcheville, whom he had known for years, could actually attract a woman, and was quite a good specimen of a man, had retorted, "Beastly." He had, certainly, no idea of being jealous of Odette, but did not feel quite so happy as usual, and when Brichot, having begun to tell them the story of Blanche of Castile's mother, who, according to him, had been with Henry Plantagenet for years before they were married, tried to prompt Swann to beg him to continue the story by interjecting, "Isn't that so, Monsieur Swann?" in the martial accents which one uses in order to get down to the level of an unintelligent rustic, or to put the fear of God into a trooper. Swann cut his story short, to the intense fury of their hostess, by begging to be excused for taking so little interest in Blanche of Castile, as he had something that he wished to ask the painter. He, it appeared, had been that afternoon to an exhibition of the work of another artist, also a friend of Madame Verdurin, who had recently died, and Swann wished to find out from him, for he valued his discrimination, whether there had really been anything more in this later work than the virtuosity which had struck people so forcibly in his earlier exhibitions. From that point of view it was extraordinary, but it did not seem to me to be a form of art which you could call elevated," said Swann with a smile. "Elevated? To the height of an institute?" interrupted Cottard, raising his arms with mock solemnity. The whole table burst out laughing. "What did I tell you?" said Madame Verdurin to Forcheville. "It's simply impossible to be serious with him. When you least expect it, out he comes with a joke." But she observed that Swann, and Swann alone, had not unbent. For one thing, he was none too well pleased with Cottard for having secured a laugh at his expense in front of Forcheville. But the painter, instead of replying in a way that might have interested Swann, as he would probably have done had they been alone together, preferred to win the easy admiration of the rest by exercising his wit upon the talent of their dead friend. "I went up to one of them," he began, "just to see how it was done. I stuck my nose into it. Yes, I don't think. Impossible to say whether it was done with glue, with soap, with sealing wax, with sunshine, with leaven, with excrem—" "And one makes 12," shouted the doctor wittily, but just too late, for no one saw the point of his interruption. "It looks as though it were done with nothing at all," resumed the painter. "No more chance of discovering the trick than there is in the 'Night Watch' or the 'Regents,' and it's even bigger work than either Rembrandt or Hals ever did. It's all there, and yet, no, I'll take my oath it isn't." Then, just as singers who have reached the highest note in their compass proceed to hum the rest of the air in falsetto, he had to be satisfied with murmuring, smiling the while, as if, after all, there had been something irresistibly amusing in the sheer beauty of the painting. It smells all right. It makes your head go round, it catches your breath, you feel ticklish all over, and not the faintest clue to how it's done. The man's a sorcerer. The thing's a conjuring trick. It's a miracle," bursting outright into laughter. "It's dishonest." Then stopping, solemnly raising his head, pitching his voice on a double bass note which he struggled to bring into harmony, he concluded, "And it's so loyal." Except at the moment when he had called it bigger than the Night Watch, a blasphemy which had called forth an instant protest from Madame Verdurin, who regarded the Night Watch as the supreme masterpiece of the universe, conjointly with the Ninth and the Samothrace, and at the word excrement, which had made Forcheville throw a sweeping glance round the table to see whether it was all right, before he allowed his lips to curve in a prudish and conciliatory smile, all the party, save Swann, had kept their fascinated and adoring eyes fixed upon the painter. "I do so love him when he goes up in the air like that!" cried Madame Verdurin, the moment that he had finished, enraptured that the table talk should have proved so entertaining on the very night that Forcheville was dining with them for the first time. "Hello, you!" she turned to her husband. "What's the matter with you, sitting there gaping like a great animal? You know, though, don't you," she apologized for him to the painter, "that he can talk quite well when he chooses. Anybody would think it was the first time he had ever listened to you. If you had only seen him while you were speaking, he was just drinking it all in. And to morrow he will tell us everything you said, without missing a word." "No, really, I'm not joking," protested the painter, enchanted by the success of his speech. "You all look as if you thought I was pulling your legs, that it was just a trick. I'll take you to see the show, and then you can say whether I've been exaggerating. I'll bet you anything you like, you'll come away more up in the air than I am." "But we don't suppose for a moment that you're exaggerating. We only want you to go on with your dinner, and my husband too. Give Monsieur Biche some more sole. Can't you see his has got cold? We're not in any hurry. You're dashing round as if the house was on fire. Wait a little. Don't serve the salad just yet." Madame Cotard, who was a shy woman and spoke but seldom, was not lacking, for all that, in self-assurance when a happy inspiration put the right word in her mouth. She felt that it would be well received. The thought gave her confidence, and what she was doing was done with the object not so much of shining herself as of helping her husband on in his career. And so she did not allow the word "salad," which Madame Verdurin had just uttered, to pass unchallenged. "It's not a Japanese salad, is it?" she whispered, turning towards Odette. And then, in her joy and confusion at the combination of neatness and daring, which there had been in making so discreet and yet so unmistakable an allusion to the new and brilliantly successful play by Dumas, she broke down in a charming girlish laugh, not very loud, but so irresistible that it was some time before she could control it. "Who is that lady? She seems devilish clever," said Forcheville. "No, it is not. But we will have one for you if you will all come to dinner on Friday." "You will think me dreadfully provincial, sir," said Madame Cotard to Swann. "But do you know, I haven't been yet to this famous Francillon that everybody's talking about. The doctor has been. I remember now, he told me what a very great pleasure it had been to him to spend the evening with you there, and I must confess I don't see much sense in spending money on seats for him to take me, when he's seen the play already. Of course, an evening at the Théâtre Français is never wasted, really; the acting's so good there always. But we have some very nice friends." Madame Cotard would hardly ever utter a proper name, but restricted herself to some friends of ours, or one of my friends, as being more distinguished, speaking in an affected tone, and with all the importance of a person who need give names only when she chooses, "who often have a box, and are kind enough to take us to all the new pieces that are worth going to. And so I'm certain to see this Francillon sooner or later, and then I shall know what to think. But I do feel such a fool about it, I must confess, for whenever I pay a call anywhere, I find everybody talking it's only natural about that wretched Japanese salad. Really and truly, one's beginning to get just a little tired of hearing about it," she went on, seeing that Swann seemed less interested than she had hoped in so burning a topic. "I must admit, though, that it's sometimes quite amusing, the way they joke about it. I've got a friend now who is most original, though she's really a beautiful woman, most popular in society, goes everywhere, and she tells me that she got her cook to make one of these Japanese salads, putting in everything that young Monsieur Dumas says you're to put in the play. Then she asked just a few friends to come and taste it. I was not among the favored few, I'm sorry to say. But she told us all about it on her next day. It seems it was quite horrible. She made us all laugh till we cried. I don't know. Perhaps it was the way she told it," Madame Cotard added doubtfully, seeing that Swann still looked grave. And imagining that it was perhaps because he had not been amused by Francillon, "Well, I dare say I shall be disappointed with it after all. I don't suppose it's as good as the piece Madame de Crécy worships, Serge Panine. There's a play, if you like, so deep, makes you think. But just fancy giving a receipt for a salad on the stage of the Théâtre Français. Now Serge Panine, but then, it's like everything that comes from the pen of Monsieur Georges Ohnet, it's so well written. I wonder if you know the Maître de Fourge, which I like even better than Serge Panine." "Pardon me," said Swann with polite irony, "but I can assure you that my want of admiration is almost equally divided between those masterpieces." "Really now, that's very interesting. And what don't you like about them? Won't you ever change your mind? Perhaps you think he's a little too sad? Well, well, what I always say is, one should never argue about plays or novels. Every one has his own way of looking at things, and what may be horrible to you is, perhaps, just what I like best." She was interrupted by Forcheville's addressing Swann. What had happened was, that while Madame Cotard was discussing Francillon, Forcheville had been expressing to Madame Verdurin his admiration for what he called the little speech of the painter. "Your friend has such a flow of language, such a memory," he had said to her when the painter had come to a standstill. "I've seldom seen anything like it. He'd make a first-rate preacher. By Jove, I wish I was like that. What with him and Monsieur Brichot, you've drawn two lucky numbers to night, though I'm not so sure that simply as a speaker this one doesn't knock spots off the professor. It comes more naturally with him, less like reading from a book. Of course, the way he goes on, he does use some words that are a bit realistic and all that, but that's quite the thing nowadays. Anyhow, it's not often I've seen a man hold the floor as cleverly as that, hold the spittoon, as we used to say in the regiment, where, by the way, we had a man he rather reminds me of you. You could take anything you liked, I don't know what, this glass, say, and he'd talk away about it for hours. No, not this glass. That's a silly thing to say, I'm sorry, but something a little bigger, like the Battle of Waterloo, or anything of that sort. He'd tell you things you simply wouldn't believe. Why, Swann was in the regiment then. He must have known him." "Do you see much of Monsieur Swann?" asked Madame Verdurin. "Oh, dear, no," he answered; and then, thinking that if he made himself pleasant to Swann, he might find favor with Odette, he decided to take this opportunity of flattering him by speaking of his favorite friends, but speaking as a man of the world himself, in a tone of good-natured criticism, and not as though he were congratulating Swann upon some undeserved good fortune. "Isn't that so, Swann? I never see anything of you, do I? But then where on earth is one to see him? The creature spends all his time shut up with the La Tramway, with the Loms, and all that lot." The imputation would have been false at any time, and was all the more so, now that for at least a year Swann had given up going to almost any house but the Verdurins. But the mere names of families whom the Verdurins did not know were received by them in a reproachful silence. Monsieur Verdurin, dreading the painful impression which the mention of these bores, especially when flung at her in this tactless fashion, and in front of all the faithful, was bound to make on his wife, cast a covert glance at her, instinct with anxious solicitude. He saw then that in her fixed resolution to take no notice, to have escaped contact altogether with the news which had just been addressed to her, not merely to remain dumb, but to have been deaf as well, as we pretend to be when a friend who has been in the wrong attempts to slip into his conversation some excuse which we should appear to be accepting, should we appear to have heard it without protesting. Or when some one utters the name of an enemy, the very mention of whom in our presence is forbidden. Madame Verdurin, so that her silence should have the appearance, not of consent, but of the unconscious silence which inanimate objects preserve, had suddenly emptied her face of all life, of all mobility. Her rounded forehead was nothing now but an exquisite study in high relief, which the name of those La Trémouille with whom Swann was always shut up had failed to penetrate. Her nose, just perceptibly wrinkled in a frown, exposed to view two dark cavities that were surely modeled from life. You would have said that her half open lips were just about to speak. It was all no more, however, than a wax cast, a mask in plaster, the sculptor's design for a monument, a bust to be exhibited in the Palace of Industry. where the public would most certainly gather in front of it and marvel to see how the sculptor, in expressing the unchallengeable dignity of the Verderons, as opposed to that of the La Tremouille or Lomes, whose equals, if not indeed their betters, they were, and the equals and betters of all other boors upon the face of the earth, had managed to invest with a majesty that was almost papal the whiteness and rigidity of his stone. But the marble at last grew animated, and let it be understood that it didn't do to be at all squeamish if one went to that house, since the woman was always tipsy, and the husband so uneducated that he called a corridor a collidor. End of Part 3, Section 10, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.